The room looked exactly the way my daughter had described it to me 3 months ago, standing in my kitchen with her laptop open, pointing at pictures on the screen. "Dad, isn't it beautiful?" she'd said. And she was right. It was beautiful. High ceilings, warm light coming through tall windows, round tables draped in ivory linen. A string quartet playing something soft near the entrance. Outside, the late October sky had gone the color of old copper. I stood near the back wall with a glass of water in my hand, watching the tables fill up, and for a moment I let myself believe the evening was going to go exactly as planned. Then my son-in-law's best man stepped up to the microphone, and the room changed. He was maybe 32, a guy I'd met twice before, once at the engagement party, once at a rehearsal dinner I also paid for. And he had the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about a bill in his life. He tapped the mic, smiled at the crowd, and started talking about my son-in-law, about their friendship, about the wedding day. Normal stuff. I was half listening, still watching the door for a few late arrivals, when he pivoted. "Of course," he said, grinning, "we all know who the real star of this wedding is, not the groom, not the bride." He paused for effect. "It's the old man over there who opened his checkbook and couldn't say no." Laughter moved through the tables like a wave, not polite laughter, the other kind. I turned toward the sound. My wife was laughing. Her hand was over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking and she was leaning into her sister, and they were both looking in my direction. My daughter who had stood in my kitchen 3 months ago, who I had watched grow up, who I had driven to dance recitals and soccer games and sat through every school play for, even the bad ones. My daughter was laughing too. The best man wasn't finished. "I heard he almost said no to the ice sculpture," he continued, "but then he remembered he's basically a human ATM, so—" More laughter. Someone at a nearby table said something I couldn't make out, and the people around them thought it was funny. I set my glass down on the nearest table. Slowly. I'm not sure why slowly, it just seemed important to do it that way. I want to explain something before I go further, because I know how these stories sound. I know the version where the older man is the fool, the one who should have seen it coming, the one who kept writing checks long after the signs were there, the one who has only himself to blame. I've had that thought myself, more than once, in the months since this happened. There's truth in it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But here's what I want you to understand first. I met my wife 11 years ago at a function through my company. She was 51, recently divorced, and she had a daughter in her early 20s who she spoke about with a kind of protective fierceness that I found moving. I was 60, recently retired from 34 years in civil engineering, and I was lonely in the specific way that men my age are lonely, surrounded by enough comfort that no one notices, including sometimes themselves. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. During those 2 years, I learned that her first marriage had left them in a difficult position financially. Her ex-husband had been charming and largely absent, and had treated the family's money as a personal resource to be depleted at will. By the time the divorce was final, my wife was renting a 2-bedroom apartment, and her daughter was working part-time to help with groceries. I didn't come in trying to fix anything. I want to be clear about that. But I was stable, and I cared about them. And over time, the boundaries shifted, the way they do when people live together and trust each other. Or when you think you're building trust. My daughter, I'll call her that because that's how I thought of her, even if the paperwork never said it, was 24 when I married her mother. She was working at a salon, living with a roommate, trying to save money. Within the first year, I helped her pay off a car note that was drowning her. The year after that, when she wanted to take a cosmetology licensing course that could move her up to a management track, I covered the tuition. Small things, then bigger things. A security deposit on a better apartment, a few months of rent during a gap between jobs, a laptop, dental work she'd been putting off for 2 years. I didn't keep a ledger. I didn't make her feel like she owed me something. That wasn't the point. I thought I was part of a family. When her boyfriend proposed, I'll call him my son-in-law because, again, that's what I thought he was becoming. She called me before she called almost anyone else. She was crying, the good kind, and she said, "Dad," he asked me. And I said, "It's about time." And we both laughed. The wedding conversation started about 2 weeks later. The number they had in mind was not a small number. I've lived in this country long enough to understand that weddings have inflated into something almost unrecognizable from what they used to be, and I tried to approach it without judgment. But when my daughter mentioned the venue she wanted, a restored historic estate about 40 miles outside the city with a full catering minimum and a 2-day rental requirement, I did the math quietly in my head and took a breath. "How much are you and your fiancé contributing?" I asked. There was a pause. "We've been saving," she said, "but with rent and everything, it's been hard." I asked what they could put in. $8,000, she said. Maybe 10 if they pushed. The venue alone was going to run close to 22,000. Catering for 140 guests at the per-plate cost they'd been quoted would be another 38,000. Photography, flowers, the dress, the band. By the time we went through the list together, the number was sitting at just under $90,000. I told her I needed a few days to think. I thought about it carefully. I thought about my retirement accounts, about the money I'd set aside, about what made sense and what didn't. I thought about the fact that $90,000 is, for most people in this country, a down payment on a house, and that I was being asked to spend it on a single evening. But then I thought about her face when she called me. "Dad," he asked me. I said yes. What I didn't do, and this is the part I have turned over in my mind many times since, was have an honest, explicit conversation about what my contribution meant in terms of how I expected to be treated. I assumed that the money came with a certain basic dignity attached to it. I assumed that paying for the vast majority of someone's wedding meant that you would at least be treated as a guest of honor, as a person who mattered, as someone whose presence was valued. I was wrong to assume. I know that now. The months of planning were not unpleasant, mostly. There were decisions I wasn't included in, which was fine. I didn't need to choose centerpieces. There were occasional moments when my input on something practical was waved off, which I noted but didn't press. There was one afternoon about 6 weeks before the wedding when my wife and daughter were going over the final catering contract, and I pointed out a discrepancy in the per-person cost that would have added nearly $4,000 to the final bill. My daughter said, without looking up from the paperwork, "It's fine, Dad. You said you'd cover it." I did say that, and I did cover it. What I noticed, though, was the way she said it. Not unkind, exactly, but the same tone you'd use with a credit card that you'd already decided to run. I noticed it, and I let it go, the way I'd been letting things go for years, because the alternative, confrontation, hurt feelings, the possibility of being seen as someone who gives with strings attached, felt worse than the discomfort of staying quiet. The wedding day itself was genuinely lovely for most of the afternoon. The ceremony was outdoors on the south side of the property, with old oaks overhead and the light coming in low the way it does in late October. My wife looked beautiful. My daughter looked like the best version of herself. I walked her down the aisle because her father hadn't been in her life since she was 9, and she had asked me to, and that moment, her hand on my arm, her squeezing once just before we stepped forward, that moment I would not trade for anything. What came after the ceremony is what I need to tell you about. The reception moved inside to the main hall. The cocktail hour was pleasant enough. I was introduced to family members of my son-in-laws whom I'd never met, and most of them were perfectly friendly. His uncle from Portland, a retired firefighter named, well, I'll just call him the uncle, who spent 20 minutes telling me about fly fishing in Montana and who seemed like a genuinely good man. A cousin from Chicago who asked thoughtful questions and thanked me sincerely for the evening. Then dinner started, and the toasts began. The maid of honor went first, and was lovely. My son-in-law's father said something short and emotional that made half the room reach for napkins. Then the best man stood up. I already told you what happened next. What I didn't tell you yet is what happened in the silence after. I was standing near the back wall. I'd moved there during cocktail hour because the room was warm, and after the laughter died down, after the best man moved on to something else, and the crowd's attention shifted, I stood very still and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I took stock. Not of the money. The money was gone the moment I agreed to spend it, and I'd made my peace with that. What I took stock of was the fuller picture. The car note. The licensing course. The security deposit. The months of rent. The dental work. The dinner tonight. And the $11,000 I'd spent on the rehearsal dinner the night before. The way my daughter had said, "You said you'd cover it," without looking up. The way my wife had laughed. I didn't feel angry exactly. I felt something more like clarity. I was walking slowly toward the head table, still not entirely sure what I intended to do, when my son-in-law pushed back his chair and stood up. He was not a man I knew well. We'd had maybe a dozen real conversations in the 3 years he and my daughter had been together. He was quiet in a way that I'd sometimes mistaken for indifference, and I'll admit I had not spent much energy trying to know him better. That was my mistake. He crossed the room toward the best man, took the microphone from the stand before the best man could reach for it again, and tapped it once. The room quieted. He stood there for a second, looking at the floor, and then he looked up. "I want to say something," he said. His voice was calm and even, and he spoke the way people speak when they've been thinking about saying something for a while. "I've been sitting here listening, and I need to clear something up." He turned slightly in my direction. "The man who paid for this wedding," he said, "walked my wife down the aisle today. He did that because her own father chose not to be in her life, and because he chose to be here instead. He has been choosing to be here quietly for a decade, without making anyone feel like they owe him anything." He paused. "He is not a human ATM. He is not a punchline. He is the reason this evening exists in the form that it does, and I am grateful to him, and I am embarrassed that he had to stand in the back of his own daughter's wedding and listen to that." Complete quiet. My wife had stopped laughing. My daughter was looking at her husband with an expression I couldn't fully read from where I was standing, somewhere between stunned and ashamed. The uncle from Portland started clapping. Then a few other people. Then most of the room. My son-in-law set the microphone back on the stand and sat down. I stood there a moment longer. Then I walked outside. The October air was cold after the warmth of the hall. I stood on the stone terrace and looked out at the dark lawn and the old oaks, and I stayed there for a while, just breathing. My daughter found me about 10 minutes later. She came out the side door and she was carrying my jacket, which I'd left on the back of my chair. She held it out to me without saying anything at first, and I took it, and we stood side by side looking out at the dark. "I didn't tell him to do that," she said finally. "I know," I said. "I should have stopped it." She meant the toast. I laughed. I shouldn't have done that. I knew it was wrong, and I laughed anyway because everyone else was laughing, and I just... She stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, Dad. I want to tell you that her apology fixed everything, tied it up cleanly the way stories are supposed to end. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like the beginning of a much longer and more honest conversation, one that was years overdue." "Why did you think it was okay?" I asked, not with anger. I genuinely wanted to know. Not just tonight. Why has it been okay for so long to treat what I do like it's nothing? She was quiet for a long time. "Because you never said it wasn't," she said. That landed. She was right. I had never said it wasn't. I had smiled and absorbed every slight and every dismissal, and told myself it was because I was generous, because I didn't want to make anyone feel indebted, because that's not why I did what I did. And all of that was true. But there was another truth underneath it, one I hadn't looked at very carefully, which was that I was also afraid. Afraid that if I said that wasn't okay, the whole arrangement would crumble. Afraid that the only thing keeping me in this family was my usefulness. When you're afraid of that, you become exactly what the best man called me. Not because anyone forced you, because you allowed it. "I need things to be different," I said. "I know," she said. "Not with the money." "I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about being a person in this family. Being treated like one." She nodded. She was crying now, quietly. "I know," she said again. We stayed outside for a while longer, and then we went back in. The next weeks were not smooth. There were several conversations with my wife that were harder than anything we'd navigated in 11 years of marriage. I told her what I'd been carrying, and she told me what she'd been carrying, and some of what she said was difficult to hear, and some of what I said was difficult to say. We saw a counselor twice in November, and I won't pretend it resolved everything, because it didn't. But we were talking, really talking, the way we hadn't been for years. My son-in-law called me about a week after the wedding, on a Tuesday afternoon. He said he hoped he hadn't overstepped. I told him that he had done the single most decent thing anyone had done for me in a very long time, and that I was grateful, and that I hoped we could spend some real time together at some point and actually get to know each other. He laughed a little. "I'd like that," he said. My daughter and I had dinner together in early December, just the two of us, at a diner not far from her apartment. We talked for 3 hours. She told me things she'd been holding since her father left, about what that did to her, about the story she'd built around it, about how she'd spent years treating every older man who tried to care for her as someone who was eventually going to leave anyway. So why let it matter? Why let it be real? She wasn't excusing what happened. She was explaining the ground it grew from. I'm not a therapist. I'm a 63-year-old retired engineer from Ohio. But I listened, and I think that was mostly what she needed. I paid for dinner. She reached for the check, and I waved her off, and she said, "You don't have to do that." And I said, "I know." And she understood that that was different now, that I was choosing it, not defaulting to it. I drove home that night on the interstate with the radio off, just thinking about the 34 years I'd spent in an office learning to look at structures, bridges, overpasses, retention walls, and ask what was keeping them up and what might eventually bring them down, about how I'd spent all that professional energy on careful analysis and then gone home and refused to apply any of it to my own life. A structure that looks fine from the outside can have compromised foundations that nobody talks about. You don't fix it by ignoring the damage. You fix it by assessing honestly and rebuilding where it matters. We are rebuilding. It is slow and sometimes uncomfortable, and nothing is resolved in the clean, complete way that I used to imagine resolution looked like. My wife and I are closer now than we were before October, which is strange, given everything that happened in October. My daughter texted me last week a picture of a shelf she'd just assembled in her apartment, proud of herself, and I texted back a photo of the crooked shelf I'd installed in our garage in 1987. And she sent back 3 laughing emojis, and I sat at my kitchen table and smiled at my phone like a man who has been given something back. The best man sent a text to my daughter after the wedding, apologizing, which she forwarded to me. I read it once and set it down and decided it didn't require any energy from me. The only thing I know for certain now that I didn't know clearly enough before is this: being generous is not the same as being a doormat. The difference isn't what you give. The difference is whether you're giving from a place of love or a place of fear. For too many years, I couldn't honestly tell which one it was. I can now. The morning after the wedding, I sat at the hotel breakfast and drank 2 cups of coffee and watched the light come up over the parking lot, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy, exactly. Not resolved. Just clear. That's enough to start with. I'd been a structural engineer for most of my adult life. 34 years of looking at bridges and overpasses and asking one question: what is actually holding this up and what is quietly failing underneath? You'd think a man trained to see hidden damage would be better at recognizing it in his own house. But I wasn't. And I think I understand now why. When you're afraid that the structure will fall if you test it, you stop testing it. You just keep adding support from your side and hope the whole thing holds. That's not engineering. That's denial. And for years, that's exactly what I was doing. What my son-in-law did at that reception wasn't a small thing. He didn't have to stand up. Nobody expected him to. He'd known me for 3 years, and we'd had maybe a dozen real conversations in all that time, and yet he looked at what was happening and decided it was wrong and said so in front of 140 people. That takes something most of us spend our whole lives trying to locate in ourselves. A willingness to do the right thing even when it cost you something. Even when silence would have been so much easier. I've thought about that moment a lot in the months since, about what it means to act with that kind of integrity. Not the loud, performative kind that wants an audience, the quiet kind, the kind that stands up in a crowded room, not because it will make you look good, but because you simply cannot sit still while something wrong is happening. That's character. That's the thing you can't fake and can't buy and can't inherit. You either build it slowly over years of small choices, or you don't have it. And then there's what my daughter said to me on the terrace. Because you never said it wasn't. That sentence has stayed with me longer than any other part of that night. Because she was right. And because being right about it required a kind of honesty that I hadn't been willing to apply to myself. It takes real intelligence. Not the kind measured on tests, but the kind that looks at your own life without flinching. To sit with a truth like that and not explain it away. She could have deflected. She didn't. That took something from her, too. And the rebuilding. That's the part nobody talks about. The part after. The dramatic moment after the speech and the apology and the cold air on the terrace. The part that's just two people or three people sitting in a diner or a counselor's office or a kitchen, doing the slow, unglamorous work of being honest with each other. That work requires a kind of endurance that has nothing to do with toughness or pride. It's quieter than that. It's just showing up again the next day and the day after, even when the conversation is hard and the progress is invisible. I'm 63 years old. I don't have the luxury of thinking I have unlimited time to get things right. But I also know that getting things right late is still getting things right. The shelf my daughter texted me about last week, crooked, slightly off-center, exactly the kind of small, proud thing you do when you're building a life. I looked at that photo for a long time before I wrote back. Some structures take longer to build than you planned. That doesn't mean they aren't worth building.